There was an article in Climbing Magazine where Delaney Miller was asking the question, or really making a statement, that climbing gyms have lost their soul. And for me, as someone who started designing climbing walls back in the early 2000s and has been developing climbing facilities, meaning the whole thing, architecture and climbing walls, for the last over 10 years, and now doing it around the country with various clients, I think a lot about this, and I don't disagree with her at all because I think we can do a lot better. And so the question I ask myself is, what does that even mean? What do I mean by that? So that's what I'm going to get into here a little bit. So, what is it about climbing gyms these days? Is it that they're filling a need and not really doing much else? They're sort of filling the market and, people see opportunities, so they build these things. I mean, that's what a lot of industries go through, where you're filling a need first and foremost. But are they any good? And, I think in a lot of ways, looking back 25 years when I started climbing, there's a ton of difference. And that's a big part of what Delaney is talking about is the sort of things that we've lost over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that that is really sort of the question I ask myself a lot, which is, what is it about the architecture of a space? What is it about the space itself that gives it a certain feel? And that's a conundrum that architecture in general has been looking into for a long time. And really, the question is like, what can we do about it? And the answer I have is that this isn't magic. It's not that you just hope it feels a certain way. There actually are ways that we can extract ideas, extract goals in terms of what we want it to feel like, and then use the tools and things that we have at our disposal, specifically the design of the space, the way things relate to each other, very specifically lighting, materials, choreographing the sequence through a space. All these different things have a lot to do with the way that spaces feel. When I look at most climbing gyms, I would say that there's a lot of similarity. The walls generally look very similar. Back when we built the first Brooklyn Boulders Somerville, meaning the first one I worked on, that is, um, we did a huge vertical solutions climbing wall, and that amount of wooden wall wasn't that common back then. The front had done it, but it wasn't really something that had been done as much. In fact, there were conversations about, trying to get some sort of exclusivity or something around it because it was so unique at the time. Today, 10, 12 years later, totally different. Every single wall builder that I see has natural wood options or a natural wood look option, some even with different types of wood or different stains of wood and things like that. So if that's not the differentiator anymore, I think wall builders are going to have their own situation where it's not about aesthetic that is the thing that separates them. It has a lot more to do with other things, the service, the delivery. Are they fulfilling their expectations, things like that. But getting back to the architecture, the climbing walls are all becoming very similar. Generally, it's like a lot of squiggles and color kind of all over the place. And for me, it's sort of, when I look at it from my perspective as someone who's put a lot of climbing walls and climbing gyms together, I just think we can do better. And that's what I try to do in the facilities I work on. The idea of creating a feeling or a mood in the person in a space is something that architects have been looking into and thinking about for a long time. In the late 1700s, and this will be quick, I promise, but hopefully entertaining, people like Piranesi and Boulez, they were doing drawings that were a response to the Renaissance and the sort of overabundance of the Baroque style, these gilded buildings. And they were really looking into the idea of the sublime. And the sublime, according to Kant, is a feeling that is produced, and it's something that you struggle to reconcile. And it's sort of a disjunction between what we're looking at and what we're feeling. And there are intentional tools and tactics that were being used by people like Piranesi and Boulez. They were playing with scale. They were playing with the actual drawing techniques. They were using these things to create a certain state of mind or elicit an emotion, which was what they were trying to do. And remember, this is the late 1700s. but they're trying to create a certain uneasiness that they were thinking of as the sublime in the sort of truest sense. And they were also using other techniques like ruins from the past, So a lot of these drawings are sort of like ruinous. A lot of them are using geometric solids or primitive geometries like spheres and pyramids, things like that. And then, when you look at these drawings, the scale is very off. You look at some of these and they're these huge buildings. And so this is something that back in the late 1700s, when people were looking into this idea of the sublime, how can we elicit an emotion and a feeling through the architecture and the design that we're doing? This is something we've been thinking about for a long time. And I think that sounds pretty familiar in the context of what we're talking about here. Just like artists who were looking at the idea of the sublime and drawing these sort of out of scale, primitive pyramid objects that were intended to create different emotional feelings and elicit emotions, we can do the same thing in our own sort of modern times. A big part of where we have to start, though, is with intent, meaning what is it that we're trying to do? And this is something that has to be able to be stated in a narrative sense. You have to be able to describe something without pointing to it or telling me it's a circle or a square or whatever. Those are tactics to get to the intent, which is the goal. So we have to start there. And that's why with all of my clients, that's where we start. We're trying to extract information and then we synthesize that information and then we put it into a visualization that is based on all of those pieces of material and goals that we've established. And that's how we can judge, is it doing anything that we're trying to do? And so that is something that I do a lot when I'm teaching as well. Like one thing I'll do with students is ask them to tell me about their building without telling me what it looks like. I found that to be a really good tactic because it forces you to describe something in a different way. So we make drawings, but you're describing it verbally. It's a very different process. And it's something that I think actually can be very helpful. And so being able to define the intent in a narrative way to me is the very beginning of how we create a building that has a clear goal, part of which is creating a certain type of field, certain type of user experience like we're talking about here. The reason why I like to use movies as an analogy is because they, in that process, have to take an idea, a written script, a narrative, like I was just talking about, and turn it into a visualization that has the right feel. So in this example, the director was asking for something like what he remembered growing up in Montreal and Montreal in February. And that's what this image was trying to be. And so there's this idea that isn't talking about snow necessarily. It's not talking about color or anything. It's this narrative intent. And that's why you have to start there, because then we can use the tools at our disposal: geometry, scale, materials, lighting. Use computers, don't use computers, doesn't matter. These are just all tools that we can use to get to the goal, get to the narrative intent of what it is we're trying to do. So what is it that we've got? We have architecture, the building, and we have climbing walls. You have to look at them at the same time. And I've been doing it that way for, again, over a decade now. And that's how you get to use your money wisely. I'm not saying you need a big budget. What I'm saying is let's spend the money in a smart way and let's coordinate the architecture and the climbing walls, which are the two main components of a climbing gym, in a better way and be more critical about it. This is something that just happens as industries mature. I think the climbing gym industry compared to certainly 10, 20, 30 years ago is dramatically different. And there's just a long way for us to go. I'm very bullish on it. Regardless of what you think of the Olympics, things like that represent exposure and they represent a certain type of progress. Again, whether you agree with that or not is a different conversation, but it's getting out there more. We're building more gyms. So it's a perfect time to be asking ourselves, how can we do it better? And that's what I spend a lot of time thinking about. This is why the team that you put together is so important, because you have to be able to extract the intent of the project, the ingredients for the project. It's the experiences that we all bring to the table that help us synthesize that information, because it's not just about using the same materials. It's not just about using the same quantity of materials. A lot of it has to do with how we put it together. And I love this image because it sort of represents that in a cookie fashion, which I appreciate. And that really is what it is. It's about more than just adding up A and B, because it's not that simple. Everybody's project is different. A big part of my goal with clients is to figure out what their intent is. And what I know to be true is that it's very different. Each client has a very different focus. All kids, no kids, climbing team, no climbing team, international events, no events, whatever it is, locker rooms, no locker rooms, individual locker rooms. I mean, these things have tremendous impacts on the architecture of the building, the layout of the spaces, and the climbing wall. When you look at anything that I'm working on, I'm simultaneously designing the building and the climbing walls from the very beginning, because they go back and forth. Otherwise, you're sort of chopping something off and saying, you deal with this, we deal with this. Maybe they have to talk to each other to some degree, but probably not much. The way that you go about creating things, it's like a director, it's like a chef. We might be using the same ingredients, but who's doing it? How do they do it? That's what creates the unique result for you. The good news is that this is the case in any industry as it's maturing. You look at, I mean, look at skateboarding, for instance. These wooden backyard ramps have turned into these mega skate parks and international companies, some of which I've done work with. And so I'm sort of familiar with the degree to which these things have evolved, and climbing is nowhere near that. And so maybe that is a vision into the future of where we could be going. I have a lot of nostalgia for my early days climbing at the Pawtucket Rock Gym, the Rhode Island Rock Gym, which doesn't exist anymore. Pea gravel, 20-foot walls, no lead climbing. The only bouldering was this roof, effectively. You know, I loved that. I don't want to go back there. We can do way better. And so that's why I spend so much time thinking about it. And so there are different ways we can go about it. There are different things we can do to cater to the different types of users. Users have evolved. It's not just hardcore climbers. In fact, hardcore climbers often, they might not even be your main business, because they might not even want to pay to show up, which makes it hard for it to be a business. But how do we give them what they need while also introducing people to the sport? These are pretty wide ends of the spectrum, right? It's a pretty big gap there. And how do we introduce people into the sport without scaring them off, without, Delaney mentions like people sort of yelling in the gym and things like that. Perfect. That's great. People climbing with no, dudes with no shirt on or whatever. If that's your thing, you should be able to do that 100%. And in my mind, that right there, as I'm saying it, what is that wall that they want to climb on? Maybe they want to be sort of showing off. So that wall, how do you make a wall that's for showing off? Make it prominent, make it tall, make it in a sort of visible area. These are just very simple things of how to, deal with that particular situation. Other end of the spectrum, somebody who's new to climbing, how do you make it so that then when they walk into a gym, they're not like horrified by that very same person? How do you make it so that they're not walking into CrossFit where it's just bars and weights banging around? If that's what you're going for, then great. If it's not what you're going for, then that's great too. But we need to choreograph the architecture and the climbing to make a building. We are making buildings, not just making climbing walls, not just making a shell for climbing walls to go in. That's filling a need. We can do better. And that's what I work with clients to do, is figure out how we can use the techniques and the tools and the tactics at our disposal to do that. This isn't magic, but there is a degree of mastery and sort of wizardry involved, because we're putting things together. And even though for my clients, it doesn't always seem clear, we are able to make the jump from intent, ingredients, and synthesis to visualizations or sketches and visualizations very quickly, because we understand the problem properly. And because I have my own experience as a climber, as a climbing wall designer, as an architect, as a climbing gym developer, that's how we put these things together. I certainly have my own unique way of doing it, just like any chef, just like any director. If you want to work with me on projects, reach out and let's get to it and let's make these things better. Honestly, we have a long way to go. myself included. That's why I keep asking the question. If this is helpful for you, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you have questions or comments, things you want me to talk about, write me a comment. I'd love it. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video.